Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Be the Good podcast. I have with us here today Jessica Keenan Smith. Jessica, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
It is my pleasure to have you here, and I'm happy to share more about the work that you're doing. So, you were diagnosed as a teen with epilepsy after having several grand mal seizures. Can you tell us more about that time in your life and how you were able to navigate the challenges of epilepsy at such a young age?
Sure. So I was diagnosed at 12. I had my first seizure, which was a grand mal seizure or tonic-clonic, as they're referred to, as I was preparing, excuse me, to go on vacation with my best friend Amy and her family. Um, my parents found me in the hallway on the way to the shower. Um, Upstairs. I guess there had been a huge bang. As I fell to the ground, I remember waking up to find my parents and paramedics standing around me. Um, but thankfully, my parents really encouraged me to really participate in life fully. So, in high school, I was pretty active in theater, and I played on the field hockey team. I was terrible, but I was on it for, more social than anything else. I swam in the summer. We skied as a family in the winter. But in reality, you know, it took years to find a combo of meds that worked. Not only to control my seizures, but also that were, that the side effects didn't, rule them out, so to speak. I spent a lot of hours in the nurse's office. I was also often kind of toxic on meds and kind of holding on to walls headed to classes. And I was not delightful to be around. I was moodier than your average teen, which is saying a lot. And my parents were really like, if you think about it, it was the late 80s, early 90s, late 80s. And my parents were pretty convinced that I wasn't going to live to graduate high school. I mean, tonic-clonic seizures are pretty dramatic and scary. So, and I would have them often enough that they just were convinced, let's see if she'll live to graduate high school. But then I did, and they were even more terrified when I wanted to graduate and go off to college 200 miles away in New York
Yeah.
City.
Yeah,
So,
I would imagine that was
yeah.
probably really heavy for them. And so it took, as you said, years of, trying to find the right combination of meds that controlled the seizures with minimal side effects. But you did eventually, as you're saying, go on to college, which I think is so incredible for you and your parents. So thanks to your doctors, you were able to go to Fordham University, live on campus, and even get your degree on time. Can you tell us more about what it was like to work through those challenges or, that period of your life moving into college? And how fulfilling was it for you to graduate, on time, such a huge accomplishment? And then what were you led to do after graduating? Can you tell us about that also?
Sure. I mean, graduating on time wasn't really an option. Um, in the family that I grew up in, it was, you know, it was presented to me as, okay, this is the school you want to go to. You need to go through the business school if you're going to go there, because we're paying, and those are your options. And if you're going to go there, you get 4 years and that's it. I mean, I come from, pretty like stern family. It's a big Irish Catholic family, and like you get what you get and you don't get upset, kind of. So 4 years was it. It wasn't really, I never thought of it in terms of like going to the disability office or like looking for accommodation. So, I also never thought of it as take a year off, that wasn't an option. It was, you go to college. But once I got there, my peds neuro should never have said to me should never have said to my mother in front of me, there is the possibility that she could grow out of her seizures. Because I took that to mean, well, I haven't had a seizure in a while, so I must have grown out of them. So I got to college, I beyond my parents' eagle eye view, and I was like, well, I must be cured. So at least in like the second half of the year, freshman year, I was like, I don't think I need to take these meds anymore. Yeah. So
Ugh.
I decided I was good. I was cured. So most of spring semester I didn't take my meds. And then I probably had one of the worst seizures that I've ever had the last day when my parents were meant to pick me up. And as far as I understand it, they passed the ambulance as they were coming to pick me up.
Wow. Wow.
Um, and obviously, I hadn't done very much in the way of packing. So not only did they need to come get me at hospital, they also had to pack up all my stuff. They were not pleased, to say the least. Um, I eventually did figure out that I needed to take my meds regularly. My pediatric neurologist essentially cut me off around the time of graduation. She was like, I can't keep prescribing your meds. I'm a pediatric neurologist. You're an adult. So again, it was like the 90s. Like there was nothing in the way of like transitions, the way they talk about it now. That didn't happen. It was like, I can't keep refilling your prescriptions. You need an adult neurologist. And I was like, where? How do I do that? I was in a whole new city. I had no idea where to start. So that was the very first time I hired a doc, had a bad experience, fired a doc, and I lucked into finding a neurologist that specialized in the care of women in epilepsy. Thankfully, during my 20s.
Wow.
So I was lucky to find her because she took me off valproic acid, which we now know is really bad for women of childbearing age. And I was also lucky to find a therapist who was affiliated with the Epilepsy Foundation because a lot of epilepsy meds cause anxiety and depression. And I got to see that person and didn't have to kind of lay the groundwork for, and this is epilepsy and this is how it's impacted my life. She already came to the table with all of that. And like, I only had to pay her $4 a week to see her, which was ridiculous. So
Wow.
I
Yeah.
followed her into private practice. So, I mean, some of, some great stuff, some not great stuff, but that's kind of life.
Yeah. And you really had to, I mean, that's a lot to take on at that age to have to try and navigate for yourself and advocate for yourself. But it does seem like now knowing what you do and the work that you do for this epilepsy community that I would imagine your experience really has helped fuel your passion to help others, kind of find the solutions and the answers or the support more easily. So they don't have to kind of struggle to figure that out. So in 2009, after decades of living with epilepsy, you had discovered how to navigate the US health system, as you were sort of mentioning here, found your voice as an advocate, and you discovered a way to live with this chronic illness. So, with limited resources, you created a blog to share what you learned. Can you tell us more about what inspired you to create that blog and what has it now grown into?
Sure. So, um, at that point, my husband and I had moved out of New York City to southern New Jersey, so just outside of Philadelphia. I was working for the Wharton School in donor relations, managing, gosh, more than like 1,000 endowed funds. I was working with their fundraising team. I had a toddler. I think she was like 2.5, maybe 3. And I had just had a second pregnancy that failed because of a neural tube defect, which women with epilepsy are at a higher risk for. So the baby had hydrocephalus caused by spina bifida. And we discovered that at 20 weeks. At that point, I started writing letters to the baby. We had named her. She was going to, we had a gift for our little girl. When we told her the sex of the baby, like, this person was going to be part of our family, it was part of our story. So I started writing letters to her. And since I was a teen, I had kind of felt like I had a story in me, and over my 20s, I had, like we had talked about, I had learned all this stuff about navigating the health system, but frankly, I just didn't have the bandwidth to write a book with everything that I was juggling. So Twitter and WordPress had just come out at that point, and I thought, well, I have stuff I want to share, but I don't have the time or the energy to write a book, so I'll start a blog. And I didn't really have the emotional grit at that point to share my story, my emotional blah. So I just wanted to share resources. So my first articles were essentially, how to find a neurologist, how to fire a neurologist, how to find information about your condition. It was just basic how-to stuff. But people started to come to me from all over the world looking for a way to share their story, their experience. So I essentially just cracked open the back, because in 2009, you could do that. You could do it pretty easily, and taught myself how to code, so that I could build out a navigation, and have places for the how-to stuff, places for the personal stories, a way for people to submit stuff so that it wasn't flooding my email. And from there, it kind of grew. Essentially, I changed to WordPress and got more involved with the pharmaceutical industry, meaning I was invited to participate on patient advocacy boards and share what I had learned from the patient perspective. I got more involved in kind of academic research. But it wasn't until a couple of years later that I was sitting around the table at a World Federation of Neurology meeting that I realized I was not only the only skirt at the table in the room, but I was the only patient. And as I went to sit down, a gentleman kind of nudged his coffee cup over, as though I was there to help, as though I was staff meant to clean up.
Wow.
And I looked at him, he looked at me, and I went and I put my stuff down and I sat down. And then when I had something to contribute meaningfully during the meeting, we again kind of looked at each other, and nothing was ever said between us. But for me, it was sort of a milestone. It was like, it's important to have patients at the table. And that's happened a number of times throughout this journey. So the blog was just the beginning. And every time I'm a patient that can go toe to toe with leaders in the community, in the scientific community, it's important for me and it's important for them.
Yeah, that's a really powerful story. And I can see, also being in the rare disease space myself with my nonprofit, I can see how valuable it is to have the patient at the table, but how much there has been a lack of that up until recently. And thankfully, I feel like it's starting to shift, but really it's probably in large part because of people like yourself who have showed up in the room and not felt, not allowed the fear of, do I belong in this space, to, override what you came there to share, and hopefully taught that man and his colleagues something that day about the importance and the necessity of having patients involved. And I think that now, knowing what your site has grown into, I think it's incredible that you have, what started as just like a simple offering of information and resources has grown into such a powerful community and resource and hub really for patients to feel seen.
Yeah.
So, as a member of the epilepsy community, you work hard to make this Living Well with Epilepsy a trusted resource to and reflective of the millions of people who are suffering from epilepsy. The site is also meant to be a useful tool for loved ones and caregivers. Can you tell us more about the challenges that many who suffer from epilepsy, along with their families and caregivers, face in terms of stigma, isolation, and just a general lack of understanding about this condition?
Yeah. Um, that's a big question. So, um, eh, the stigma is real. And sort of our loved ones, our friends, our colleagues who readily accept us are surprised by that. You know, if I talk about the stigma at a cocktail party with people that I've known and who are teachers and social workers and docs and accountants and lawyers, who know and value me, they're like, really? But they've already accepted me as a person. And they assume that they don't know anybody else with epilepsy. The isolation, so the stigma is real. The isolation is probably the biggest issue throughout the community, throughout the world. And as I've done surveys in the community since I started, that has been the biggest issue for as long as I've been doing this. Sort of a lack of social connectedness, which has been studied, not just in epilepsy, but in a number of disease states, but a sense of isolation in the community. And some of it is self-imposed. Some of it is due to the fact that oftentimes people with epilepsy can't drive, don't have a mode of transportation, live in rural areas, et cetera, et cetera. Some of it is, I don't share about my epilepsy. I don't talk about it. So I don't know anybody else locally. It's not like some other disease states where either I can see it or it's not stigmatized, so I'm willing to talk about it. So you and I talked about the fact that I was diagnosed with stage 3C ovarian cancer. When I was diagnosed, I was like, I told literally the world. I sent out a text chain to my neighbors. I told my friends. I told my whole family. I told my college girls. I told everybody. I didn't hesitate to do that. And I told them right when I was diagnosed. When you're diagnosed with a neurological condition, it's chronic, so you know it's going to last a long time. B, there's this sense of, well, it's not going to kill me. Even if it is a disease state that's degenerative, like Alzheimer's, there's a sense that it makes you less capable. So you need to kind of hide it. And in that needing to hide it, you lose the ability to get that community around you, which is really important. So that isolation and lack of community has a ripple effect. It also doesn't help that the medical community sort of doesn't balance the need for seizure control with quality of life. And that isolation piece is part of quality of life. So, and that's a piece that I work really hard on.
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, now that you explain it that way, the isolation is probably debilitating at times, especially if you live in like a rural area, like you said. Like if you can't drive and you can't get yourself out into community,
Mhm.
what are you supposed to do to create the community for yourself? And that was going to be my next question, actually, is, what would you say is the true value and importance of community for those who suffer from epilepsy? And I think we kind of just hit that, but also I guess I will turn that question in a different way and say, like, what would you say is the value of these online communities
Yeah.
because of that? Like that now makes it that much more clear to me how important your website is, so that someone who lives in a remote area who can't really get access to a community where they feel support, what have you found people like that, or just people in general who are a part of your online community? What is the real value for them?
Yeah. So I guess since the pandemic have started having conversations with some of them one-on-one, some of them in a group setting, um, with women living with epilepsy, some of them newly diagnosed, some of them having been living with it for a number of years, all different seizure types, on all different medications, um, in the ages of, say like 20 to probably, I'm going to say 48. Um, I would say 1 out of 3 of those initial phone calls, calls, um, the person on the other side will break down into tears just at the opportunity to speak to somebody who literally gets it. Just having the opportunity to share their story in a safe space, to have their experience reflected back and validated, and not feel gaslighted or questioned or second guessed or have to justify, but instead have somebody, as they're telling their story, go, yeah, been there too, yep, had that happen to me, yep, same thing.
Yeah.
And it's like, I'm not exaggerating, 1 out of 3.
Yeah, it's really invaluable to a patient to have that experience, to a person to have that experience, to feel seen and heard and validated in something that they're struggling with,
Sure.
especially if you've gone, months or years or a long time without having someone understand that. I know many of the patients that I've interviewed for Project Scleroderma for our documentaries, when we get a group of patients together, we've filmed some like roundtable discussions, and it's really for the same purpose, to just have that community where you feel like these people get me. And the main feedback I get from patients after the fact, I mean, they're just exhilarated by the opportunity to have this conversation with other patients. And the main response I get is, you know what? My family, my caregivers, my friends, everybody loves me, cares for me, supports me. I feel supported, but they can never fully understand or appreciate what it's like to live with this disease.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really why someone would break down in a conversation with you,
Yeah.
looking you eye to eye and being able to say, you be able to say to them, uh-huh, yep, I get it. I understand. I actually
Yeah.
know what that's like. There's just so much power in being able to show up for somebody like that and just
Yeah.
compassionately listen and affirm that what they're going through is hard.
Yeah.
and, you know, and in a way that you can genuinely connect with them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know what it's like to lay on the floor and look up and be surrounded by strangers. Like, yep. And then have that massive headache afterwards
Oh,
and that embarrassment.
yeah.
Be carried down through a Manhattan like elevator and out through the lobby on a stretcher. Yep. Been there.
Yeah, and it's
Like,
something that most of us can't understand, you know,
yeah,
but having you explain it that way, I think is great because it does give us, I mean, that just put me in your position at that point and realizing, yes, that must be so hard on so many levels. The frustration of not knowing that it's going to happen at all.
yeah,
And then it does happen. And you're like, oh, okay. So here I am in the middle of, you know, the floor, and now I'm being carried out
yeah,
publicly.
yeah,
Just that's it's important for the rest of us who have never felt that to have a greater understanding and compassion for that. So thank you for highlighting that and sharing that with us.
yeah.
um, and I wanted to talk a little bit about, so in addition to your role with Living Well with Epilepsy, you're also the executive director of the American Society of Experimental Neurotherapeutics, also known as ASENT.
Yep.
Can you tell us more about ASENT and how you're working to bridge the gaps between the scientific and the patient communities?
Sure. So this is a role that I've had. So I've been the executive director of ASENT for just over 5 years now, might be six. And prior to this, I was on staff at the American Neurological Association, and um, my chair of the committee uh, that I worked on um, was the chair of neurology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And he is he's a unicorn in neurology. He's a lovely man. He has an MD PhD. Um, he has very high pedigree when it comes to his training. He was a chair for 25 years, but he's also a delight. You can sit and watch a football game with him, have a beer. You can joke around with him. He's a lot of fun. He's very realistic, and he's a delight to work with. And he was tapped to be the president of ASENT, and they needed some help moving away from their association management firm and to take on becoming a standalone association. And so in his way, he asked me to kind of look into things at ASENT, and so I looked into them. And I was like, well, they probably shouldn't be at this association management firm. They don't have very big endowment. And looked into it further. I said, well, if you're going to do this, you really should have an executive director. He was like, oh, that's so interesting. He already knew all of this. He knew what he was setting me up for. Um, so needless to say, I have been the executive director for 5 years. He's been the president for 5 years. I wasn't going to let him go that easily, but now he'll rotate off. And Andy Cole, so his name is Tom Satula, and Andy Cole will rotate on. Andy Cole is the division director of the epilepsy unit at MGH Harvard. So Tom Satula is an epilepsy guy. Andy Cole is an epilepsy guy. The person before Tom was Marty Morell, who is the chief scientific officer at NeuroPace, also an epilepsy person. All wonderful people to work with. I mean, it's sort of an executive director's dream to have a delightful president. This board is lovely and fun to work with, responsive, and they're leaders in their field. They they run the gamut within the area of neurology. So they are leaders in industry, so pharma, academia, so chairs of neurology, research, so, within neurology. Advocacy, so Alzheimer's Association, Michael J. Fox Foundation, Epilepsy Foundation, and then government, so FDA, NIH, anybody who is engaged in bringing drugs to market. So the entire drug development process from bench to bedside, essentially. And we have an annual meeting, and we have a very high impact journal that is led by Morale Meridian, who is essentially on her way to a Nobel. As she's fantastic, and she's based at Rutgers. So we're thrilled to have her as our journal editor. And she's just outstanding. She's taken this journal kind of just running up the impact factor, which is fun. And it gives me an opportunity to kind of, again, be in the room, the patient at the table, with folks who, some of our past presidents feel, and not the ones that I mentioned, but further back, feel very strongly, patients don't have a place in this conversation. But because of the clout that I've built in bringing this organization to a better place, I'm able to go toe to toe with them and have these hard conversations about patients being in the conversation. So that's fun. I'm also able to see drugs in development before they ever even hit clinical trials. I'm able to see and have conversations about research that's being iterated and ask about clinical outcomes. And is that really the outcome that we should be going for? It doesn't, it's not necessarily going to have an impact on that molecule or that drug, but it leads to other conversations. Like, are we asking the right questions at the beginning? And that's the whole point of ASENT, is to improve the drug development process. So it's really fun for me to kind of be at the table there, and then be able to connect the patient community with these leaders when needed, or with their research when needed, or translate their research to the community when needed.
It's incredible. It's incredible to me to hear the backstory of, just how challenging things have been for you since that very first seizure, just the significant challenges that you've had to overcome, and how you have turned not only your advocacy, your desire for advocacy, and your desire to show up for your fellow community members, but also how you've just used your intellect, your ability to really, amplify what's going on here in regard to what the final outcome is for a patient. It's really super inspiring. And I just wanted to make sure that I said that at some point, because it's really fascinating to me to hear this whole story unfold. And then to realize, here you are as the executive director of ASENT that's doing some pretty powerful stuff in the neurological space, and that you're able to bridge that gap for the patients to all of this really important knowledge and resources. I love that. And I did want to ask, in line with that, in terms of, compassion and how you're able to show up for this community in that way. We talk about compassion a lot on this podcast. It's one of my favorite topics. So I like to ask guests, if you could first tell me what your definition of compassion is and how it relates to the work that you do, even though we kind of just touched on that. And also, what ways would you say that we as a society can better support those who are living with epilepsy? How can we show up with more compassion, to be aware of what those who are living with epilepsy are facing?
So similar to how I talked about those conversations and the impact that those can have. And similar to meaning the one-on-ones or the group conversations I had with patients, and even the conversations that I've had with leaders in the scientific community, I think the key is really listening. I think the key to compassion, the key to change, the key to making a difference is, in part showing up, but in showing up, you need to listen. You and really listen. It's okay if you disagree, but hear that person's perspective. Listen to it, think about it, sit with it, spend some time with it. Think about how how they came to that perspective. Not everything is about you. Really listening.
Yeah.
I think that's really important.
I think I couldn't agree with you more. And it's something that I talk about a lot, again, in terms of the work that I do. It's compassionate listening is a skill that does take time, I think, to build, in the sense that you have to be aware first of the fact that you maybe aren't compassionately listening, which
True.
is, to your point, like, sometimes people just get so caught up in their own story and their own life that they don't understand the power that they hold and the ability to help other people heal emotionally if they could just sit with listening and not feel like they have to fix it, or not feel like they have to have an answer for it, or not divert the conversation because it makes you feel awkward.
Yeah.
Can you really sit with what somebody's trying to share with you and hear it and allow them to feel supported? That is compassionate listening. And I would imagine that's really what you're saying here is we as a community, as a society too, need to just be more open to hearing what your experience is, and to not be so quick to just pass it off as like, oh yeah, okay, you have this thing, you have something that you're dealing with. We all have things we're dealing with.
Yeah.
It's not something that should be brushed aside so easily like that.
Yeah. I read an article recently about a startup that failed, and it's because the founder had the solution in her mind, and she went into her customer interviews with that solution in her mind. And yes, she asked about the problem they were trying to solve, but she was so distracted by her solution that she didn't really hear the problem they were trying to solve.
And then you can't move forward. It's like
Well,
you
not
can't,
successfully.
right? You can't move forward successfully if you're so distracted by that. Yeah, you don't have the ability. And that's why I'm saying, like, I think it's a skill that we have to really be aware of the fact that we need to work on, all of us.
Yeah.
I do think that most people I've come across who have dealt with either a rare disease or some sort of illness or disorder actually have a heightened sense of awareness to that, and in turn are better listeners because you know what it feels like to not be heard, to not feel like anybody is listening to what you're dealing
Yeah.
with. So thank you for sharing that. I agree 100% on that compassion piece and the necessity for us all to be more compassionate listeners. So thank you for sharing everything you share with us today, because this is really super educational, I think. I mean, I do have somebody in my life who suffers from epilepsy, and it's newer to me, it's newer to us. So it's fascinating and interesting to me to learn your whole story and to see just how many people are impacted by this, but I can also relate to that isolation piece and I can see how that could happen. So I think it's important for us to have this conversation and for people to understand what the epilepsy community is really dealing with and how we can better support them. So, can you tell everyone listening how we can support your ongoing work and follow along with the Living Well with Epilepsy community and journey?
Sure. So Living Well with Epilepsy can be found at livingwellwithepilepsy.com. It's also on Instagram, same handle, Twitter. It's actually on Twitter, it's under my name, Jessica Keenan Smith. Facebook under Living Well with Epilepsy. I guess the best way that you can support is by sharing stories that are on social media or on the platform with people in your life that you love, but also by encouraging others to share their story on Living Well with Epilepsy. You can also subscribe to the newsletter. But honestly, if you share a story with somebody, that will make a huge impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will be sure to link all of those things that you just mentioned in the show notes so everyone can easily find you and follow along. And I too would encourage everyone to share the stories so that we can help just create more awareness
Yep.
around the experience of those who are living with epilepsy. And I thank you for everything that you're doing for the epilepsy community and
Thank you.
just for being brave enough and willing to share your story with us today. So thank you so much for being here.
No, thank you.